This is Backroads of Illinois server to farmers and ranchers in central Illinois and the Midwest. Today's edition of Backroads of Illinois. We were bringing you lasted for farming sources and information sponsored by AgriGold. We were glad that you were here on a Wednesday afternoon on Backroads of Illinois. We were talking about the swine health on today with Dr. Megan Nidwenerd from Swine Health Center. Then I'm joining with Mike Castle of StoneX Financial Services on the fertilizer division. We were talking about the fertilizer markets with these tariffs issue with Mike Castle. Otherwise, this is your rural news sponsored by AgriGold. In southern Illinois is battling with the rains weather. They have some planting delay due on the rains and severe weather in southern Illinois near Quincy and St. Louis. The corn planting progress in Illinois is 74%, and soybean planting is 67%. I mentioned before, in southern Illinois is battling with the rains and severe weather on the field. Finally, this month is a beef month. We were celebrating for our beef producer and a rancher for our country. That's your rural news sponsored by AgriGold. I'm joining with Mike Castle of StoneX Financial Services on the fertilizer division. Mike, how are you?
Doing great, Caesar. Good to be back with you.
Mike, how is the fertilizer prices for this quarter?
Well, it's been pretty firm so far in 2025. Urea, UAN, and phosphate prices all rallied to their highest levels since late 22, early 23 this spring. But thankfully, the nitrogen side is finally starting to see a correction as we kind of move past the peak of application season. But phosphate keeps running higher here. On the potash side of things, it's rallied to start 2025 as well. Also starting to see a bit of a cool off there. Obviously, with as fast as planting season has gone here, we're seeing rapid progress on the fertilizer side of things as well, getting things knocked out really quickly. That's kind of why we saw, a peak get put in maybe a little bit earlier than typical. The urea side is really where a lot of the strength has been, driven in the nitrogen complex. But a lot of that was more so a lack of UAN availability. Um, we saw a lot more demand shift to urea, further south than typical earlier this spring because we came into the year super tight on the UAN side of things, specifically because we've got our weakest net imports through the July, March, the first 9 months of the fertilizer year on record. Basically, just continue big exports of UAN, small imports this year. So we came into the spring season really tight on UAN supply and then had a couple of plant outages. So we started running into availability issues starting back in like March or April. Obviously, as we started to kick off pre-plant applications, as planting season got underway, as we really got into the swing of spring field work, a lot of folks just ran into the situation of I physically can't get my hands on UAN right now. I've got the weather for it. I want to get in the field. So basically, it was, hey, give me whatever nitrogen source I can get. And that shifted a lot of demand to urea there. And then obviously, kind of had the effect as demand started moving north of, oh man, that supply isn't there anymore. So we got pretty tight there. We did see some pretty huge imports come in March. So, it's kind of making its way into the system, but that really hot start to the spring season just kind of firmed things up. Drove NOLA urea prices all the way up to $540 a ton, which again was the highest we had seen since late 22 when things were kind of coming down from their all-time highs. So Thankfully, it has corrected significantly since then. As we look out forward, it's kind of been this big inverted market the whole time where we knew that relief was, on the way at some point. We just kind of had to get through the worst of it. And it does appear like we've gotten to that point now. So we have seen things kind of, fall off here. The one other, kind of interesting thing to look at on the nitrogen side is just how cheap anhydrous has been compared to urea and UAN. Ammonia prices globally have kind of been soft here to start 2025. A lot of that isn't necessarily driven by the ag side, but weak industrial demand instead. So it's been, kind of one thing that we're watching is the potential for more side dress demand being shifted to ammonia versus UAN. Again, for those who kind of struggle to find the supply, it does sound like as we get into June, availability is looking a lot more favorable. So it will be kind of a big question of how much goes that direction. I know here in Missouri, we've seen that. Who's to say how much that kind of happens here in the month ahead, but it's certainly something to kind of keep an eye on. But again, overall nitrogen, it does feel like we're kind of past the worst of it, finally starting to see this, typical seasonal correction.
How has the river been for fertilizer from the Mississippi River to the Illinois River?
We've had issues again, and that was, kind of part of the issues that I mentioned before. Obviously the river has been a pretty common issue of the last couple of years. We've dealt with a lot of low water problems, specifically on the lower Mississippi. And then this year we kind of got the opposite of that this spring. If we look back to the fall, things were very low. And then, as we moved into kind of late winter, early spring, we started to get a lot more rain, especially in the Ohio River Valley. And we saw flooding on, a fair amount of points on the Ohio River that eventually made its way down into the Mississippi. And we had some high water issues this spring on the lower Mississippi that led to some barge delays, some limited availability, kind of some, again, lack of supply being able to make its way upriver. So again, we ran into the situation where we didn't have the available UAN at these inland, markets, and had folks needing to switch to urea. But again, you had issues getting barges upriver because of that high water when you're already looking at stuff being relatively tight because more southern demand points soaked up that urea than typical. And it ended up, kind of causing some issues. It does seem like things have calmed down here to a pretty good extent. Things are flowing a bit more normally. So again, we're kind of getting to this point of calming down, hopefully past the craziest part of it so far.
Of course, Mike, we were seeing some issues with the Mississippi River again. Can you tell us what's news about the trade barriers with the fertilizer markets?
Yeah, thankfully, that's another situation where it appears that the word correction on phosphate later this summer, at least on the global market. Again, I don't know how much of that will influence us. Potash, globally speaking, it's really not reacted. It's just been NOLA. It's just been the U.S. because of that tariff threat. Potash, I don't really see any reason to go much higher or lower. I think we're pretty fairly priced where we're at on the global market. But really, a big part of it's just going to be keeping an eye on China. Again, they're saying they're going to come back, but we've seen that we can't necessarily rely on that info a whole lot. So it will be something we got to keep a close eye on here. But really, summer fill programs, I think it's going to be, important to kind of stay on top of things this year because we just saw this past season what can happen if you wait till the last minute to buy. If you're not on that list when we run into these supply availability issues. So again, would always encourage our farmers to have those conversations with their suppliers early. A lot of your best buying opportunities happen after these summer fill programs. Obviously with where grain prices are at, nobody's going to get real excited about pulling the trigger on anything. From an affordability perspective, excluding potash, again, it's still cheap enough. It does look like a pretty good buy. Phosphate is really the most stubborn one. I would say that's the one where I think we could see some demand destruction for the fall season and potentially even the following spring in 26. But a lot of that really, I think, is what it would take to see an actual price correction on phosphate. So maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing. Other than that, I mean, from the supply side, phosphate, there's really no reason to go down. So again, I do think some amount of demand destruction may be the thing that has to happen to get us to cheapen up. But other than that, keep your eyes out for summer fill announcements here in the next couple months. Hard to believe we're already through the spring season in a lot of areas and kind of winding down in others. But, overall, it's been a pretty hot and heavy spring and should kind of finally calm down here for a bit and, again, turn our attention to summer fill programs.
A lot of stuff dive in.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Thanks, Mike.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
We've been talking about the fertilizer markets with Mike Castle of Stoneaxe Financial Services on the fertilizer division on back. We were talking about the swine health on today with Dr. Megan Meter-Winder from Swine Health Center. Dr. Megan Meter-Winder, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Great. Dr. Niederwender, let's discuss about the swine health. Could you tell our audience what is the importance for biosecurity procedures for the swine health?
Yes, so I serve as the executive director of the Swine Health Information Center, and our center was launched in 2015 with pork checkoff funding, and our mission is to protect and enhance the health of the U.S. swine herd by minimizing the impact of emerging disease threats, and we do that through various activities, including preparedness, coordinated communications, global and domestic disease monitoring, analysis of swine health data, and then taking that information, understanding what the greatest risks are to the U.S. swine herd, and thinking about how we can target research investments to try and provide new tools and new knowledge back to producers to try and protect the health of their herd. When we talk about biosecurity, that is certainly an important umbrella to think about protecting the herd health from both endemic diseases such as PRRS and PEDV, but also transboundary diseases such as African swine fever virus and foot and mouth disease virus. Foot and mouth disease virus.
Did you grow up in the hogs industry before you started with your career?
I did not. I went to veterinary school and then I practiced as a veterinarian and then also obtained a PhD in swine virology. So my history and background is really focused on how do we look at diseases of swine and either prevent or mitigate the impact of swine diseases on production.
Can you give us an update as F for right now?
Yes, we continue to monitor African swine fever virus as a significant disease threat to our industry. The U.S., of course, is negative for African swine fever virus, and we want to do everything we can to maintain the U.S. as a negative country. Currently, the closest country that is positive for ASF is the Dominican Republic and Haiti on the island of Hispaniola. So just geographically to North America, that those countries are the closest. We continue to monitor ASF in those countries, looking at what is the distribution of cases, what is the percent positive with regards to sampling and surveillance? Are there any changes in risk within that island and what's going on in their hog populations there. We also continue to keep a close eye on what's going on in Europe and Asia with African swine fever virus. Specifically in Europe, we keep a close eye on those countries that may continue to have ASF outbreaks in domestic pigs. For example, over the last month, there were 4 countries in Europe that had outbreaks in domestic pigs, including Greece, Moldova, Romania, and Ukraine. And then also keep an eye on what's going on in the wild boar population in Europe. There are also ASF outbreaks in that wild boar population. So how do we learn from what's going on there? That can certainly help us in our prevention and preparedness when we think about our feral swine population here in the U.S.
What do you recommend within this disease if it is coming to the United States? Dr. Megan.
For ASF, we really want to keep an eye on what's going on globally, thinking about where it has been introduced into new countries or regions. That can come into play when we think about employee downtime that may be visiting those countries that have ASF. We want to think about talking about that with our animal caretakers and that producer, thinking about how do we protect our pigs from any fomite contamination, such as clothing and boots, and how do we prevent any risk of introduction. When we think about biosecurity practices that we recommend for endemic diseases, such as site-specific clothing, site-specific boots, thinking about ensuring your supplies and equipment are decontaminated before coming on site, thinking about reducing the risk of personnel visiting multiple sites in one day or utilizing vaccine crews, transport crews. How do we think about reducing the risk of disease transfer through personnel? We always think about how that can reduce the spread of endemic diseases, but also how it's protecting our pigs from these foreign animal disease threats.
What about the furrows?
I'm sorry, Caesar, do you mean the sow herds?
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, one of the things about biosecurity with sow farms, when we compare that to, let's say, the wean to harvest phases, is that oftentimes producers have biosecurity protocols that are higher in the sow herds or breeding farms, thinking about protecting those reproductive animals and nursing piglets. We see sometimes in those herds that they utilize filtration to reduce the risk of pathogens entering into the farm through aerosolization. And we think about some of those protocols and their applicability to the older age group. So when we think about nursery pigs or grow finish sites, some of those protocols can certainly be helpful in reducing the risk across all phases of production. And then one of the areas that the Swine Health Information Center has really been working on over the last few years is thinking about how do we better disinfect, decontaminate those transport vehicles that assist our industry in really efficient production, but can also be a risk for disease spread.
What is your final thoughts on this spring when the weather is nice with biosecurity threats?
Yes, I think one of the benefits about the spring is the warmer weather, and that oftentimes pathogens don't survive as long in the environment. Most viruses like cold weather and are more stable in cold weather. But I think the challenge that occurs in the spring and summer is trying to prepare ourselves for some of the insect threats. So we have recently released some information for producers to try and reduce the risk of mosquitoes around barns. And thinking about, of course, control of standing water, as this is a breeding ground for larvae. Thinking about reducing the vegetation around the buildings, which can serve as resting sites for mosquitoes. Ventilation can assist with the reduction of mosquito risk, as well as, of course, chemical strategies. And so, one of the things as we go into the spring and summer months is that we have to start thinking about some of these disease threats that occur more in the summertime, which would be the risk not only of insect bites, but also any diseases that they could transfer.
Do you have any concerns about the bird flu in the herds?
You know that the risk of H5N1 with regards to swine, we've really had a large research effort ongoing over the last year. Last year, we formed a research program that's a $4 million research program with the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, the Swine Health Information Center, and the Pork Checkoff to try and reduce the risk of H5N1 introduction and prevention to our commercial swine herds. And so we have research projects that we're looking at to try and understand what the clinical presentation would be if it's introduced into hogs and how we best prevent and protect our herds. And so we have that research program ongoing. We are glad that H5N1 has not been introduced into the commercial swine herd, but we want to be prepared and understand the risk.
Thanks, Dr. Nidwenerd.
Thanks for having me, Caesar.
We've been talking about the biosecurity procedures for the swine industry with Dr. Megan Nidwenerd from Swine Health Center for Back Roads of Illinois. Thanks to Dr. Nidwenerd from Swine Health Center and Mike Castle of Stone Activist being Back Roads of Illinois, I am Cesar Delgado. You have a good day.